Hello and welcome to today's session on high leverage practices in special education. We are going to be providing an instructional overview today. So we've already talked about the first domain of collaboration, the first domain of high leverage practices. And then you've got the opportunity to work with Angie on all of the practices covering assessment. And now we're really going to dive into the fourth session on HLPs over instruction. So we are going to cover HLPs 11 to 22 today. Please know that this is strictly an overview. And if you are interested in diving a little bit deeper into these high leverage practices, starting in September, you will have the opportunity to sign up for additional webinars that take place then, where you can dive a little bit deeper into all these. So I'm going to give you an overview and give you lots of resources. And then in September, that starts the training series on really diving deeper into these last 11 practices that we're going to talk about today. All right, so our learning objectives for today are really just to familiarize you with the high leverage practices within the instructional domain. And then we want you to understand the positive impact that these high leverage practices can have for all students. Remember, what's critical for some is helpful for all. So making sure that you are using these practices consistently and frequently within your positions to support all students. And then talking about some of those resources and strategies within the instructional domain. And then really thinking about how are you using these within your current practice? Are there things that you're doing really well? Or are there other things that maybe today you'll get some ideas where you can improve your practice and build upon what you're already doing? Okay, so we've got stuff today. Presentation slides, handouts, and all resources are located on our Padlet. So I'm going to step out here and just show you what's available on that Padlet. If you have been a part of all of our series for the high leverage practices, then you've already been exposed to this. It's the same Padlet that we're using. We just keep building onto it so that you have all of the resources in one click of the mouse on your computer. So padlet.com/IEPTA/HLP series will get you there. And let me just show you what's available. Katie, did you follow my screen, or are we on the Padlet together now?
Yep.
Okay, so you have all of the high leverage practice resources for all 22 high leverage practices. You have the historical sessions on collaboration, assessment, and student well-being. Those are the 3 previous sessions that we've had so far. And then you also have all of the documents for the instructional high leverage practices that we're going to cover today. So you'll notice the PowerPoint is here. I'm going to talk about some IEPTA developed resources that you have access to. I'm also going to talk about NCII, or the National Center on Intensive Intervention today. You have access to that. Some documents, both the skills chart and root cause chart by Margaret Surley are available for you, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into those today as well. So anything that I reference within the PowerPoint, you'll be able to find in this column titled Instruction. And finally, within the Padlet, we have our 2024 training catalog, and this is where you can go in and sign up and register today for those trainings that will take place in September, that will start a new HLP series, but just on the instructional practices that we're going to cover today, but more in depth when you sign up for in the fall, in September, all the way to December. So we're offering one of those each month in the fall semester. Okay, let's take it back to the PowerPoint now. More people coming in. All right, the first thing that we want to talk about today is the effect of efficacy. So in the chat, go ahead and type what you think efficacy is. Or if you're a brave soul and want to unmute your mic, that's fine too. Libby, you just joined, so if you could type what you think efficacy is in the chat, that would be helpful. Okay, so Katie says the ability to be effective. And it really has to do with that belief that you can be effective. Not only do you have the belief, but you have the knowledge and skills to make an impact. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So when we talk about making an impact, we know based on research that there are things in teaching and practices that we do that have a positive impact on our students. There are other things that actually research states have a negative impact on what we're doing and everywhere in between. So when we talk about those positive impacts, we're going to look at the research of John Hattie, and we're really going to look at anything above a 0.4 effect size is a good practice, is something that we want to implement. Anything below that 0.4 really doesn't give us really what we want for our efforts that we put in. The outcomes aren't there to support that's a good practice for education. So everything that we do should really fall into that zone of desired effect of an effect size of 0.4 or higher. So actually, when we talk about efficacy, collective teacher efficacy, that belief that teachers are able to positively affect their students is the highest effect size that Hattie has at an effect size of 1.57. Now, if you remember just from that last size, anything above a 0.4 is what we're looking for. And 1.57 is the top of the range. It's beyond that scale that I just showed you. And collective teacher efficacy isn't just a single teacher believing that they can impact a student, but it's teachers having common goals and working together in order to improve outcomes for students. So we have to be on the same page. We have to be working together in order to truly impact our students. So effect size is something that we want you to know about so that you know what practices are effective. And collective teacher efficacy is one of those practices. I'm actually going to hop out of this and show you a video where John Hattie describes what collective teacher efficacy is. And I want you to watch, and I want you to see if you can come up with some of the three like aha moments of what is collective teacher efficacy and what makes it effective for our educators and for our students. So as you're watching, what is it and what makes it effective? And you can type that in the chat as you're watching. All right, let me share my sound really quickly and then we'll get started on the video. All right, Katie, give me a thumbs up if you're on the video and if you are able to hear once it gets started.
Well, the new number one in visible learning is teachers' collective efficacy. And on the one hand, that's exciting because it confirms the story. On the other hand, it's a bit of an unfortunate title. It kind of implies that having efficacy, having confidence, having all the teachers in the school believing they can make a difference, it's actually more than that. Now, to have a meta-analysis, you have to have lots of studies. This is not a new idea. This has been around a long time. But it's just that Rachel Ells was the one that pulled it all together to show what its combined effect was. And the message I want to get across, it is teachers working together to have appropriately high, challenging expectations of what a year's growth for a year's input looks like, fit with the evidence of impact. And that's what sustains it. It isn't just growth mindset. It's not just rah-rah thinking. It's not just, oh, we can make a difference. But it's that combined belief that it's us that causes learning. It's not the students. It's not the students from particular social backgrounds. It's not all the barriers out there. Because when you fundamentally believe you can make the difference, and then you feed it with the evidence you are, that is dramatically powerful.
Okay, so the questions were, when you were watching that, what is it and what makes it effective? Any thoughts on that within the chat? So it's not just rah-rah thinking. It's not just that growth mindset. All of those things are great, but we have to have the knowledge, skills, and capacity to actually make the change. We have to know what a year's worth of input and what those outcomes are supposed to be at the end of that time. And what sustains it over time is actually the ability to look at the data and show that growth. That's motivating for us as teachers to say, hey, look, what we are doing definitely has an impact. And so that is the piece of collective teacher efficacy that we want to see. It is teachers. He said, it is us that is doing this. And that's exactly right. It doesn't matter what background your students have. It doesn't matter their current learning ability. It is that teachers believe that the practices that they put in place are what are beneficial to improve student outcomes over time. So that's that collective teacher efficacy. So we have common goals that we're working towards, which in this case is students mastering, standards at grade level. And how do we have those high expectations for all students and change up our instructional practices to get them there? And part of looking at Hattie's work and looking at high leverage practices, we know what works. Let's make sure we're implementing those high leverage practices that we're going to learn about today consistently and frequently in our classrooms so that our students can be successful. So we want to make sure that we have knowledge to support all of the students with whom we're serving. We want the skills to implement those supports, and we're going to continue looking at the data over time as well. So the next thing that's important to mention is it's not just teachers believing that they can have an impact or groups of teachers believing that they can have an impact. It also is a high effect size when we talk about student efficacy. So let's watch this video, and as you're watching within the chat, kind of, do you have a student that you're thinking of that may send a message to you if they were asked to be a part of this video? And if so, what message do you think that they would share with you?
Dear teacher, I know it doesn't always seem like it, but I really do want to listen and learn. It's just my brain is kind of different. So this is what I'd like you to know about me. I have to move, or I really can't pay attention.
Even though I'm not looking at you, I can still listen to what you're saying.
If you tell me, sit up straight, now I have to use all of my brain to do just that.
It makes me feel sad when you tell me to try harder, even though I've already tried as hard as I can. I actually listen better when I'm rocking in my chair. When you give me a bunch of directions, I start to think I will never remember all of this. Sometimes my mom or dad ends up doing all of my homework. So here's how you could maybe help. Let me get up and move while I'm learning.
Let me look wherever I want when you talk to me.
Let me rock or slouch in my chair.
No matter what, please don't take away my recess. Give me help I could do all by myself. Make directions very short.
Just ask me, what does your brain need right now?
And one more thing. My brain might be different than yours, but it's still amazing. Sincerely, your student.
Your student.
Your student. Your student.
All right, so what we have here, we have students whose brains are different than ours, and they teach us a whole lot about what works for them and what doesn't work for them. So anything in the chat that your students have taught you? I learn better when I'm rocking in my chair, right? For us, that could be distracting. But for that student, it works for them. Libby says, I learned patience, new ways to look at things. Absolutely. Some students like to have music on when they're doing their homework. For me, music is a distraction, but for others, it gets them at a pace and a flow that helps them learn. So it just depends. And we have to be able to realize that people learn different and there's variance of learning that takes place, whether it's like ours or if it's different than ours. So Twyla says, figuring out how each students learn best and support it. Absolutely. And Twyla, I'm going to build on that because it's more than just you figuring out how they learn best. It's giving students opportunities to be able to help determine how they learn best and be able to communicate that to others. So we talked about collective teacher efficacy, and it's so important for our teachers to have a belief that students can be successful and know what that looks like. But it's also important for our students to be able to recognize what they are able to do and let them have that belief in themselves. So remember, the effect size when we were talking about collective teacher efficacy was 1.57. But quickly after that is student self-efficacy. So students recognizing that they're able to have some success. And if they think that they're able to do it, then they will. And we have to promote that in our students and help them realize their potential so that they're able to meet that over time. So yes, not just helping students understand how they learn best and us as teachers understanding it, but letting students figure that out and giving them that knowledge to help them become expert learners so that they then have the belief that, yes, I can do this. So part of that is looking at what goals students set for themselves, helping them achieve those goals. Just like collective teacher efficacy and teachers building on that data and that's sustaining, same thing for students. When students see their data get better, then that's motivating for them. So how are we utilizing that with our students? All right, so collective teacher efficacy and student efficacy are things that we definitely want to see frequently in schools, and really everyone working together to create that climate and culture within buildings where there's that belief that we can do hard things and we can be successful. So high leverage practices that are aligned with each of those are really on that instructional area. And if you have not attended the previous sessions, we've already done a session on collaboration, assessment, and student well-being. And now our big focus is really on instruction. So we're going to do a brief overview of 11 to 22 today. And the first one, number 11, is identifying and prioritizing long and short-term learning goals. So we do this often for our students within their IEPs, right? We have our annual goals that we're putting into place that we're working towards with our students. But even short-term goals, whether they are benchmarks within the IEP or whether they are just short-term learning objectives within the classroom, can definitely be things that we are helping students understand. This is what you are working towards, and here's why you are working towards that. Think about your students. If somebody came up to them and said, hey, what goals are you working on, either in the classroom or within their IEP, would they be able to articulate that? And if the answer is yes, kudos to you. You're doing exactly what you need to do. But if they're not able to tell you what they're working towards, whether it's a single lesson or whether it's within their IEP and we're looking at a more annual basis, then we need to start helping students understand these are the goals that you have. So we have a couple of resources that could be beneficial to you when we're talking about goals. One is a goals checklist, and this is really more geared toward those annual goals. So what are the things that need to be in place in order to create strong annual goals within their IEP? This is available to you within the Padlet that we referenced earlier in the slide deck. So if you are interested in just checking your current goals to see how you're currently doing and writing goals based on present levels, and really making sure that they are skills that could really help the student in the future, this is a tool that could be helpful for you. But again, we don't want just annual goals. Of course, those are required within their IEP, but we have to help students really understand what the learning targets are in the classroom and set their own goals. So this is a goal setting sheet, and there are many that you can find. This one I happen to pull from Leanne Young that talks about, what am I going to do 6 months from now? And maybe that's too big for some of our students. Maybe we're going to tailor it down to a week, or maybe we're just looking at the 50-minute lesson that we have in front of us and what do we want to accomplish during that time. But really helping students understand what those targets are and where we want them to be. Because just like Young and Hattie and some of the researchers say, that when students set their goals, they actually are more likely to achieve beyond the goal that they set for themselves. So when adults are setting goals for kids, that's great, but if we don't let them in on the information of where we want them to be, or don't let them have a voice in what that goal is, it can be so much more powerful if they're a part of that goal setting process. Any ways that you are currently including students in that goal setting progress now, for anybody that's on, want to say in the chat? And while you're thinking, I'll tell one story of a school that I was in. I was in an elementary building, and one of the teachers, she has the data binders, and within her data binder, she has learning targets. So the overall learning target for a lesson. And then within that, she breaks down the learning targets into 3-4 steps, depending on what that learning target is. And each assessment that the student has working closer towards that overall learning target, they will measure the success of how they're doing making it to that goal. And they get to say, they get a sticker if they're getting there, and then they have steps that they're going to take if they haven't made it quite to that goal of how they're going to work towards that. So they are very knowledgeable of what they're supposed to be able to do by the end of this unit, by the end of this lesson. And they're able to track that independently when they get their scores back. So they're paying attention to the feedback that they're given, and they're able to adapt. Yes, I made my goal. No, I didn't. And where am I going to go next? But that makes learning theirs, and they're able to own that. Whereas when we just say, this is what you need to know, and here's your assessment, it takes them out of the equation. So it's much more powerful when we're involving the students in that goal. All right, let's see if we have anyone in the chat. So Twyla says not presently, but when I taught elementary, staff sat with students and their reading goals together, track their own goals each week, love seeing their progress. Absolutely. So I see this a lot with oral reading fluency, right? We read 28 words per minute this week, and now we're up to 50 words per minute, you know, a month and a half later, whatever that might be. And students love seeing that trend line go upward, and it's motivating for them. Just like when you see your students all get A's on their exam, it's motivating. And when it's not, we are teaching students that, okay, we're not making our goal. It doesn't mean we can't do it. It means we have to change what we're doing in order to get there. Just like when students are failing your tests and assessments, you need to change your instruction and respond to that. We need to teach students that what we're currently doing isn't working. We need to revise that and change that up a little bit in order to meet our goals. So goal setting is one of those high leverage practices that we definitely want to see in our classrooms. One more message here. Libby requiring students to write long-term goals for the trimester and 2 short-term goals for each 6 weeks. High school students have not had to write goals before. Absolutely. So we are helping them learn how to do it. And then I love the fact that they have a pizza party. You know, they're getting that incentive for reaching their goals. Thank you for sharing, Libby. Oh, the pizza party by assessing their goals, not achieving their goals. Oh, even better. So just looking at that progress over time. Thank you. Sorry, I went the wrong direction with that. But definitely that motivation piece, and sometimes motivation has to be extrinsic before it can be intrinsic. So we have to give some type of tangible item before they're going to be able to really be self-motivated in the work that we're giving them. But seeing that data over time and those improvements will help with that. So HLP 12 is systematically designing instruction toward a specific learning goal. So this is where that specially designed instruction comes into play. We talk often about how do we, design instruction towards goals? How do we help students reach those grade level standards and really scaffold those supports along the way? And that's what HLP 12 is. In your Padlet, you have a specially designed instruction checklist that helps you think about how am I really adapting this instruction to best meet the needs of our students. And from Article 7 and IDEA, when we talk about specially designed instruction, we talk about adapting the content, methodology, and or delivery of the instruction to best meet the needs of our students. So look at point number 2. They have access to meet the educational standards. Let's keep reading. The educational standards within the jurisdiction of the public agency that apply to all children. So this is that push for students meeting grade level standards. They need access to grade level instruction in order to ever meet those standards. So we have to give them that access, and then we have to modify what we're doing to support our students in order to reach those goals. So the checklist really helps you determine, does my specially designed instruction really look at the practices that students need that need to be individualized? Is it meeting those unique needs that we talked about? Is the delivery customized for those needs that we just described? And then we can look at different ways that we're developing the specially designed instruction, maybe how we're providing that specially designed instruction. Are there access skills that students need first in order to get to the standard? And how are we teaching to those access skills? We're not watering down curriculum, but we're giving the skills that they need in order to maintain those high expectations and give them access to the grade level standards. And for some students, that may be content connectors, if that's appropriate. But we always have the end on what are the standards for all peers within the system. That's what the law says. So how do we keep that in mind? And then really looking at what are the barriers, what's causing this, and how do we help students overcome those barriers? And then finally, we're going to monitor that progress over time to determine if what we're designing is working or not working for students. And then, of course, always in special education, looking at those generalization of skills. And we'll actually get there. That's a high leverage practice in and of itself. But this SDI checklist is available for you within the Padlet as well. So again, when you're looking at IEPs, you have a goal checklist, you have an SDI checklist. I think the biggest thing about specially designed instruction to consider is that when we're providing specially designed instruction, it has to be planned for. We have to ensure that it's happening on a regular basis, not just every now and again. It is something that makes special education special, and we are legally obligated to provide this to our students. HLP number 13 is adapting our curriculum, task, and materials for specific learning goals. So whether that is a goal within the classroom, whether that's a goal within the IEP, we need to adapt what we're doing in order to best meet the needs of our students. So the end goal is the same. How we get there might look different. And that's what this is all about. You know as well as I do about accommodations and modifications. Typically, people are well versed in each of these, but I think it's important to have conversations about what they are. And then we're going to do an activity where I give some examples and you get to determine whether you think it's an accommodation or a modification and maybe why it's one, not the other. When we talk about accommodations, we are changing how a child learns or how they access the curriculum. The curriculum stays the same, but how they are gaining access to that information is what is different for them. Maybe we provide the material differently. An easy one is if the entire class is reading the Odyssey, then I might provide that as an audio version for a student. The material stays the same, but we are changing the way the student is accessing that. We can change the way a student responds. So if students in the class, the expectation is to write a 5-paragraph essay about the Civil War, but writing is not a strength for my student, but the target is to show what you know about the Civil War. Maybe they do a role play and act out what that looks like. So the response, I'm still able to gauge their learning of the Civil War, but the way in which they respond is different maybe than some of their peers are responding. And though some students require accommodations, that's something that when we offer choice like that to all students, we're increasing engagement. We are letting students start to understand their best way of learning. So helpful for all students, definitely something that you don't have to have an IEP to be able to respond to something different as long as our learning targets stay the same. And modifications, that's where we are changing what is taught, or we're changing some level of the curriculum where the standard is varied. We're changing the complexity level for our students. So we are taking maybe 8th grade curriculum and we are teaching 3rd grade curriculum instead. It's still aligned to those 8th grade standards, but it may be a content connector. And these are the skills that are needed in order for the student to be successful. So it's changing that level in which the student is working at. Remember, we have to think about modifications, and we're talking about students who are earning credits at the high school level. When we start modifying things, it changes what they're working towards, and they may not be eligible for that credit any longer. So that matters when we're talking about diploma types. So accommodations we could do for students with IEPs, we can offer those supports to other students as well. But modifications is when we start changing things, and we have to make sure that everyone on that case conference committee team is aware of those changes that we're making. So let's do a little show what you know about accommodations modifications. What I want you to do is, you don't have Post-its because we're utilizing the chat. So don't use Post-its, but use the chat. As I read this example, I want you to put A for accommodation, M for modification, or B for both in the chat based on what you think the response is. So a 9th grade student is provided a calendar to break down a large project into smaller parts, and is provided extended time and a half to complete this assignment. Do you think it's A, M, or both? Twyla says accommodation. Megan says accommodation. Lily says accommodation. Katie's going with accommodation. Okay, so this one, absolutely. We are taking a big project. The standards stay the same, and we are breaking it into smaller parts so it's more manageable, and we are giving extra time. We did not change the complexity of that assignment. We just made it easier for that student to be able to complete by removing the barriers of this large assignment that's overwhelming and causes frustration, and some of the time parameters on that assignment in order for the student to be successful. So absolutely right on that one. Okay, a test is read aloud to a small group of 3rd grade students. Is it accommodation, modification, or both? Accommodation. Yeah, that one's just an accommodation, assuming that they are taking a test that is based on 3rd grade standards, right? And hasn't been changed or modified at all. So we are just simply taking a 3rd grade test that these 3rd grade students are taking. All students within their class are taking it, but we're going to read it to them because reading is a barrier to them being able to show what they know on that assessment. A 5th grade student is working alongside peers in the general education environment. The learning activity is based on content connectors aligned to the 5th grade curriculum. What do you think about that one? Accommodation, modification, or both? Megan says modification. Katie says modification. Yeah, and you both are correct. And the key hint here is really based on the content connectors. So when we're talking content connectors, Typically, those are students with more significant disabilities who are working towards those content connectors. So it's aligned, but it's not the 5th grade curriculum. So because it's the content connectors, that is changing the complexity of the curriculum. That is a modification. Lily, why do you say A, but it depends? Got it. Okay, so specifically, I'm talking about the Indiana content connectors that are aligned with the Indiana academic standards. So content connectors in this case are not, they are aligned with the grade level standards, but they are not the grade level standards. The complexity has changed. So if you're familiar with content connectors, then that is different. But if the whole class were working on it, which would be pretty odd. I don't know of a whole class unless you had like a whole entire life skills or functional skills program. Typically, you wouldn't have a whole 5th grade class working on the content connectors. So that's more of that modification piece. But if you feel differently, please let me know in the chat or feel free to unmute if you have something else to say about that. Let's look at number 4. A student with a learning disability in math is only required to do 10 of the 20 homework problems in Algebra 1. Do you think that's an accommodation, a modification, or both? Accommodation? Kyla says accommodation. Okay. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit. Katie says either, it depends. Okay, so a little bit more information. When we have an algebra textbook, and I know we have at least one secondary person on here, but think about how they're structured. When I open up to page 85 of the algebra book, I might have the first section of the homework is 5 questions on adding integers. The next section of the homework might be 5 questions on subtracting integers. The next section might be 5 questions on multiplying integers. And the last section might be 5 questions on dividing integers. So I technically have 4 different skills on one page of that textbook. If I only give the student the first 10 problems of that algebra book, they're only being asked to do 2 of the skills, adding and subtracting. Because the way that I broke that down, they never had to show me mastery of multiplication or mastery of division. So if I said do the first 10, I'm actually modifying. Libby says it doesn't say first 10, it could be even. Absolutely. I'm just trying to prove a point here, Libby, where different ways of reducing assignments could potentially change the complexity. Now, if I were to say exactly like Libby said, do the evens, and they are exposed to all 4 different concepts on that page, then that is 100% an accommodation, like Libby said. But I just think we have to be careful of how we reduce assignment links and ensure that all concepts are covered when we're doing that, so that students aren't getting watered down curriculum. They're getting all of the standards and content that we want all students to be able to do, just at a reduced number. Perfect example, Libby. All right, the last one in social studies, an 8th grader studying the Civil War is given 3rd grade level text to learn the content. What do you think about this one? It's a tricky one. It usually causes some conversation. We have modification so far from everyone. Okay, so when we're looking here, an 8th grader studying the Civil War, the target of this lesson is the Civil War. The learning objective or target is not reading grade level text. So assuming that the 3rd grade level text has all of the key points that we want the 8th grader to master, then it could be an accommodation. Now, I've worked with some teachers in training that say there's no way that the 8th grade text or the third grade text could be all encompassing. And if that's the case, then yes, we're modifying, we're changing the complexity. But the learning target is what's important here. I'm not worried if the student can read at an 8th grade level in this case. I want the student to be able to master the Civil War. So if I'm going back to the learning target and all of the things I want them to master about the Civil War is provided in that 3rd grade level text, then it can be an accommodation. But that's why I have to know my standards well enough to say, yep, that's covered, or no, that isn't covered. And we need to somehow provide an alternative method for that student to access the 8th grade level text, which would be auditory, something different where they could still get all that content. So that's kind of your either or one, but you have to be able to know the content and know the standards and that learning target in order to get there. Questions, comments, concerns about that one? Usually stirs up some conversation. Okay. HLP 14 is teaching cognitive and metacognitive strategies to support learning and independence. And really, this goes back to that student efficacy. And we want our students to be able to know and be aware of their thinking and the processes that work for them, and really having an understanding of when they need to change it up. So we are helping students to become independent by teaching these strategies to our students. So we want expert learners, and the way we're going to get that is we have to expose students to different ways of accessing information. My sister and I were talking about this yesterday. I was not a big reader when I was in elementary and middle school and high school because I didn't like the stillness of sitting down with a book. But now I finish like a book or two a week because I listen to them auditorily and I'm able to do other things while I'm listening. But I really didn't know that when I was in K-12 environment because I didn't realize that that was even an option for me. So providing various ways to access the information so that our learners can start to recognize, hey, I'm not one who can sit down and read this book cover to cover, but if I can get up and do this while I'm listening, then I'm still able to gain the information that's needed in order to be successful. So how are we providing those access points to our students and then helping them really understand what works for me? And interestingly enough, sometimes what works for me in math doesn't work for me in reading. And sometimes what works for me in science doesn't work for me in social studies. So we have to teach different ways so that students are like, ooh, that's my way for this. Like when I am doing math problems, I can listen to music. When I'm reading, I am not able to listen to music because I can't take in both the music and the reading at the same time. So helping our students to understand that within themselves, kind of like that Dear Teacher video, and tying that back in of, this is what works for me. I need to rock in my chair. This is what works for me. I need to get up and move around. So helping students to understand that. And the way that we do that is we have to model it. We have to talk about what works for us as learners and what doesn't work for us as learners. We have to model our cognitive processes. When we're doing a think aloud about a book, this is what I'm thinking about. This is the image or the picture I'm seeing in my head. Helping them be able to see this is the process to get from A to B, and showing them and modeling that for them. Even that self-regulation component. So when we feel like our body needs to move, how do we do that? Are we able to rock in our chair? Am I able to get up and walk around in this classroom? Am I able to ask to go to the restroom if I need to reset my focus? What does that look like for me? What does my body feel like right before I start to get really frustrated and angry so that I can prevent that from happening within myself? And sometimes we have to help students talk through that so that they can start to self-regulate because they don't have that skill yet. We have to teach that to them. That's part of that metacognition and letting them see how they're thinking and how they're feeling so that they can react in an appropriate way. So that works for academic skills and it works for behavioral skills as well. Really, we talked about goals as a separate high leverage practice, but reiterating those goals and making sure that they can have some mastery. And then what does that mean next? Once we master this, where are we going to go following that? And lastly, really understanding the student's strengths and stretches. What are you good at? What are the things that you need to work to improve over time? And how do we support that learning for our students? So all of those cognitive processes are things that we need to model for students or help self-talk or talk them through so that they're able to do that independently eventually. HLP number 15 is providing scaffolded supports. So again, it's not lowering those expectations, it's keeping the expectations high and building up to what we want them to know. Lots of key points for scaffolded support. So it's across different domains of education that we're going to provide those supports for students. Some students just need it in reading. Other students might need scaffolded supports and attention and social skills, or maybe you have students who need support in all of those areas to provide those scaffolded supports along the way. We're going to use assessments in order to determine what type of scaffolds that students need over time. We have to, again, have a knowledge of curriculum and standards in order to help students get there. So what is the goal for this student, and what are some breakdown points and benchmarks I can help them to work towards getting better at the skill that they're struggling with. And I think this is important, providing only the amount of scaffolded support necessary for the student. So oftentimes we provide that support, and we forget to fade back over time. And really important that if a student is able to be independent, we need to let them be independent, and we need to take 10 steps back. They can still use a scaffold. Let's say a scaffold might be a checklist that they're utilizing with steps 1 to 5 of what they need to do to complete it. And initially we are talking them through each of those steps, we're prompting them, and then we fade out and they still have the checklist. That is still an opportunity for them to become more independent. And they may always say the checklist, or we can fade out the checklist as well if they start to become even more independent. But fading those supports over time so they don't become dependent on another person or something that they need in order to get that task done. And so if we can fade it, we want to. Gradually release that responsibility back to the student, and then really plan for any of the supports that we need to within those scaffolds that we have. HLP 16 is using explicit instruction. And you'll see in explicit instruction many of the other high leverage practices embedded within this. Explicit instruction, what are the 3 things? Can you say them in the chat for me? When you hear explicit instruction, go back to your undergrad days, what do you think of? And if you say, I have no clue, Marcee, it's been too long, that's fine too. Does this look familiar to anybody? I do, we do, you do. Not new to anybody, right? Like definitely something you've heard before. And Anita Archer is the guru of explicit instruction. I sometimes, even myself, I think, oh, I did that when I was in the classroom. I definitely used explicit instruction. But what I challenge you to do is go to Anita Archer's website on explicit instruction, and it's not there now, but I'll add it within the Padlet so that you can see it. And she has video examples from young students, kindergarten level, all the way up to middle school, high school level, where you can see her teaching instruction explicitly. And a couple of the things that I would love for you to pay attention to when you're watching is the number of times that she repeats vocabulary for students in order to really understand during that I do session. So during that part of her lesson, she's constantly reiterating the vocabulary words. She constantly, even in the I do, has opportunities for students to respond. So they are getting immediate feedback. And I don't know if you remember this from your undergrad days, but explicit instruction in that I do section really requires airless learning. So we want the students to get the answer right every single time. And when you watch Anita Archer teach these lessons, she almost gives them the answer every time. So if she's like, what did the dog do? and she asked the students and the dog ran, you see her say it ran with the students along with them. So if they're going to get it wrong, they can correct themselves just by listening to her. And she'll ask it repeatedly over and over again. So if you are kind of questioning, well, I think I do explicit instruction, but let me see what that looks like by one of the experts, go to her website and just check out one of her lessons. And it may help you realize that maybe I don't have as many opportunities to respond as I thought I did. Maybe I'm not offering that airless learning or that feedback to students in a pretty efficient way. And just check yourself on that. And I think it's a little bit eye-opening, and really it's small changes to our practices that can have a big impact on our students. So I do, we do, you do, because we know that it's not important. It's not just important what we teach, but it's how we teach that really impacts how well students learn. Many of our teachers have the curriculum in front of us, but we know as well as anybody else that one teacher with the same curriculum next door has very different outcomes because there's power in teaching. It's an art and a science all together. And how are we making sure that our teachers are able to give the best instruction to our students? And really, for our students who are at risk and disability and who have disabilities, explicit instruction is the best way to go. So we have inquiry-based models where students have to figure out kind of what we want them to know. But sometimes, especially for our students who are behind, they don't have time to figure it out. We need to tell them exactly what they need to know. So explicit instruction is really how we want to be teaching students who are more at risk. So in explicit instruction, we have effective instructional sequences. So this is just one. This is from Terry Scott. You can go to other books and see different instructional sequences, but what you will notice is you're always going to start with telling the students the why of the learning. What's the target and why do we need to know this? And connecting the dots between what they've already learned and where we want them to go. So you're connecting that for them. You're not asking them to do that for themselves. Again, this goes with learning targets and goal setting. You're going to model and demonstrate all key skills and concepts, and make sure when you are doing that, you're engaging the students within those activities. You're going to guide that student practice. Remember that airless practice is so important. And you're going to prompt and provide feedback. And the feedback is, yes, you're right, and here's why. No, you're wrong, and here's why. And you're correcting it in the moment. And then you have some type of authentic student practice where while the students are practicing, the teacher is still providing that feedback to correct any misconceptions as they're going through the assignment. And then finally, the hope is that students develop mastery. But this also, when you have teachers being able to provide that feedback in the moment, you know who's mastered it and you know who hasn't, and you know who needs more support. And that's how you can tailor your instruction after the initial lesson. So explicit instruction, I do, we do, you do. So important within the classroom, especially for our at-risk learners. HLP number 17 is utilize flexible grouping. So we want to make sure that we have homogeneous groups and heterogeneous groups flowing back and forth. It is fluid amongst the groupings that we have in our classroom. It is not always the same kids at the back kidney table with our teacher. There's a time and a place for that, but the groups need to mix up. So you might have a reading group of students who are working on a specific decoding skill, but as you get into maybe comprehension skills, you're mixing your students up together in a different way. Making sure that there are never groups within groups that students always know that they're in this group, or students always know they're in this group. We're mixing them up based on skills, based on activities that we're doing within the classroom, so that students feel the flexibility of what we're putting in place within our classroom. So in the chat now, tell me how you currently group students, maybe flexibly across your day, and what that could look like for you. Sometimes we group by skill deficits that students have. These are the things you're struggling with. You're all going to be in a group and you're going to work together in order to get better at this skill deficit. Sometimes we group by anybody who's wearing red today, you're in this group. Anybody who's wearing purple today, you're in this group. Sometimes the activity lends itself to students working with partners. And maybe we pair a high student and a student who's more at risk together in order for them to learn from each other. Sometimes we have an intermix of students all working together on a group project where it's 4 students together, and maybe it's based on the topic that they're working on. So really thinking about how are you grouping students flexibly so that you don't always have the same small groups of students who always seem to need the most level of support, really helping students learn from their peers and each other, as well as the teacher within the classroom. So always go back to that flexible grouping and try to avoid constant ability grouping within your classroom. All right, HLP number 18, use strategies to promote active student engagement. So we talked a little bit about making sure that students are actively engaged within our explicit instruction. So this pulls from that as well, but we want to make sure that students have an increased opportunity to respond within classrooms. So here are some examples of ways where you can have all students respond at one time. So what we're trying to avoid is the hand in the air, calling on this particular student to answer. We know that when we do that, it's really easy for other students within the class to phase out and not really listen to what's taking place. So we want all kids to respond every time. Some students might need to hear things one time in order to master them. Other students might need to hear them 85 times in order to master them. When we provide opportunities to respond for all students all the time, then they always get the opportunity to interact with the content. And it's the expectation of our classrooms. And what this does is not only does it improve our academic outcomes because students are more engaged, but it also reduces the problematic behavior within our classrooms as well. So this is just the way we word our questions. Instead of saying, oh, what's the date today? And one kid raised their hand, tell your partner your date today. So everyone's talking to each other about the content within the classroom. Some examples for you are on this slide. A whip around is actually when you start with one student and then you keep calling on students right next to them and go around the entire classroom. This one works best when there are multiple answers to a question. So for example, give me multiples of 4. So somebody might say 4, somebody might say 16, and you keep going around the classroom so that everybody has an opportunity to answer. Choral response is you expect the same response out of everyone at the exact same time. Hand signals, maybe it's fist to 5. How do you feel about what you're learning today? 5 if you really understand it. Give me a fist if you are completely lost, or give me a 3 if you're somewhere in the middle. Or you can do 1s and 4s as well. So think about like hand signals and how you're utilizing those. Give me a thumbs up if you've got it. Thumb in the middle if you're not really there, or thumb down. That gives everybody the opportunity to respond. And you can see right then and there where your thumbs ups are, where your thumbs down are. And you can also see where are the kids who aren't giving you a hand signal and how can you promote them to participate within the classroom as well. Cued retell is giving them that prompt in order for them to be successful and have them retell the situation that's taking place. You're giving them that expectation ahead of time. Whiteboards, we have, especially math classes, I see a lot of whiteboards being used where everyone's working out the problem together, but definitely something that can be utilized across all classes. Response cards might have on it red, yellow, green for how you're feeling about your knowledge base of the content you're currently learning. It may have A, B, C, D, like a multiple choice question where they put up the one that they think that the answer is. It may have true, false, where you're having them come up with what the answer is. So any type of response can be on a card and they can be pre-made. We're going to use the multiple choice response cards today. Everybody pulls them out of their desk and everybody gets to be able to participate in that lesson today. So that's one way that you can utilize all students responding to every question. Turn and talk is another. Sometimes giving students think time at the beginning and then pairing up and sharing that information. So think, pair, share. Then once your pair shares, sometimes you can go think, pair, share, square, and getting with another pair to really talk out maybe a discussion question that you're having about a novel or something like that. Stop and jot the entire class. You have them stop during one area of content and jot something down on a post-it and stick it in their book. Everyone is responding to that same question at the same time. Maybe it's an activity packet that they're working through, but there's an expectation for all students to complete that, not you don't have to do it because I'm calling on Jimmy because Jimmy's super smart and he gets the right answers every time, but everybody needs to do this. And it gives us as teachers an awareness of who's with us and who maybe needs a little bit more support in the lesson, in the future lessons. Just a quick thing on opportunities to respond. In the chat, how many opportunities to respond do you think you should see in 1 minute of instruction? So should I see 1 in a minute? Should I see 10 in a minute? How many opportunities to respond does research show is the most effective? Any number guesses that you might have? Libby says 2, question mark. Close. So it's actually 3. When you are actively instructing students, you want to see 3 opportunities to respond in a minute. And when I first read that research, I thought, oh my goodness, how is that even possible? If you are thinking that, again, I'm going to send you back to Anita Archer's videos on explicit instruction and have you watch her, because I've shown it during trainings before and had people count up the opportunities to respond in a minute that she has, and she has upwards of 20. So 3 seems like nothing after you watch her. It's just the way you're phrasing questions and providing different opportunities to respond for your students. So again, I'll add that to the Padlet so you can kind of check that out if you're interested. But definitely being aware of how many opportunities that your students have to respond within your active teaching and your lessons. So think about that as you're kind of evaluating how these high leverage practices within your own practice and how often you're using them. All right, high leverage practice number 19 is utilizing assistive and instructional technologies. So we have many districts who are one-to-one now, and you are, I guess, blessed or cursed depending on different situations of the technology. It's great when it's working. It's not great when it isn't working. But then also, how are you ensuring that students who need additional devices that maybe are beyond what the capabilities are of some of the instructional technologies utilized for all students, how are we making sure that assistive technology is readily available for them? So that's HLP 19. There are expectations around assistive technology and how we determine what's suitable for our students. And really always defaulting to what are the accessibility features and standard items that we can already utilize. So for instance, an iPad has several accessibility features already built in. Is that sufficient enough to support the student? And if so, let's work on utilizing that. If it's not, and they need something that has more tools that they need to access, that they need to have access to in order to access their curriculum, then we need to make sure that we're looking at all of these different aspects to determine what AT is right for a student. So I don't know if any of you ever heard of the SET framework, but you're going to start by looking at the student. What are the student's needs and how can we benefit that student? Then we're going to look at the environment that the student is a part of, and how can we ensure that the support is available across environments, or at least in the environments that it is needed in. Then we're going to look at the task. What AT device or tool is going to help the student best with the task that we're asking them to do? And then finally, we're going to look at the tools. So what happens often is people give students a tool, but they didn't evaluate the student environment and task, and there's a mismatch between the tool and what the student needs to get out of the tool. So we always go in the process of the STEP framework in order to determine the best AT for students. When we're talking about instructional technology, we want it to support learning and minimize challenges, not to bring more barriers to our instruction. So making sure it's helpful to our students. We have to explicitly teach students how to use instructional technology and assistive technology. So when we talk about determining SDI, that's important for our students within their IEP, what their specially designed instruction is. Sometimes that instruction includes training out on a technology device in order for the student to be able to use it. And oftentimes, once we train the student, they take off with it and they fly. But we have to give that instruction of how they need to use it initially so that it's used appropriately and it really helps them complete those tasks that we referred to on the previous slide. And then always evaluating the effectiveness. Is it helping us achieve the goals that we want them to achieve? And if so, we're going to continue. And if not, we may have to reevaluate what that use of instructional technology looks like. The next one is HLP 20, and this is providing that intensive instruction. So even with great access to core curriculum, we have some students who are going to need additional intensive instruction in order to best meet their needs. So number 20 really focuses on what is that process for intensive instruction. And this is where I added in the website to the National Center for Intensive Intervention on the Padlet. This is one of the handouts that they have available, but they have trainings on intensive intervention, both for reading, for mathematics, and for behavior, and really looking at how do we best support our highest needs students. That's what they're looking at on that website, and lots of good resources and modules that you can complete in order to best do this. But I think that the handout in front of you is very helpful at determining how do we intensify? What does that even look like? So changing the strength of what we're doing can intensify that intervention. The dosage, the alignment, are we ensuring that what we're doing during intervention is actually aligned with the skill deficit of that student? Are we paying attention to that the transferring of skills and generalization of skills in order for a student to get it into different settings? We have to focus on that. Is it comprehensive? And again, that's pulling in that direct explicit instruction. You start to see some of those repeats when we're talking about what is best practice for students with disabilities. Are we looking at the behavioral supports? And are we individualizing enough? And when you go on intensiveintervention.com, you'll see a DBI process, so database individualization, that really helps you look at the diagnostic data for students and then putting an intervention in place and then progress monitoring that intervention and what to do if it's not working and where to go next with determining what the data is telling us. So this taxonomy of intervention is helpful, and that DBI process or database individualization is process when you're talking about intensive interventions for students with the highest level of need. A couple other things that I think fall in this category. Sometimes we have trouble determining why students are struggling. Maybe we know the what, we know the skill deficit, but the why behind it is hard for us to determine. What I provided you in the Padlet are these root cause charts, and they have one for reading, they have one for math, they have one for attention, but various domains. I think there's about 10 or 12 of them that you can go through. But if you have a student, for instance, let's use the chart in front of us, who has poor word attack skills, and you're not really sure why, this can kind of help you determine what is the student having trouble with and where do I need to start instruction. So are they able to link sounds to letters? If not, that's where we're going to start. Can they see patterns in syllables? What is the reason for these poor word attack skills? And that helps us determine our instruction. The other thing that you have, in addition to the root cause charts, are the skills charts. What do we want students to be able to do? And I find the skill charts helpful when we're looking at goal development because it's focusing specifically on what we want students to do. So again, you have these across domains. This one just happens to be attention and focus. I wanted to show you an academic one for root cause and then a behavioral one as well. But if we have a student who's having trouble with transitions, and what do I want that student to do with transitions? Maybe I'm going to go down to the fourth one. I use self-talk and list to make plans so that I am on time and prepared. And that's what we're teaching them. That's the specially designed instruction. I'm teaching them those self-talk, which is a metacognitive strategy. I'm teaching them to make lists so that they're able to transition smoothly. And that can help us start to determine what that instruction and what that goal is for the student. So again, you have these in various areas that you might, when you're trying to come up with a goal for a student or maybe what skills they don't have that they need in order to be successful, this might be a document that you can look at for them. All right, and then we have HLP 21. Teach students to maintain and generalize new learning across time and settings. So anytime we're talking about special education, we want them to be able to do it not only in the setting that they're taught, but in outside environments. So whether that's other school environments, whether that's a community environment, whether that's at home, and how are we helping to maintain and generalize that learning across time and settings? So giving them opportunities in order to be able to do that across environments. So not just learning here, but what does that look like in a different setting? Sometimes making sure that parents and teachers are on the same page in the techniques that they're utilizing so that it can be mirrored across settings. Really helping to recognize the reinforcers across settings so that we are similar for the students. They're getting the same level of support, whether that's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, whether that's school or at home. So that they can generalize over time. And then really, like we talked about before with scaffolding, prompting levels and supporting things that are in the new environments, but then fading them out over time. So if they learned it in the school setting and we're trying to, make that happen, they learned it in the classroom and we're trying to make that happen in the cafeteria. In the cafeteria, we might be providing more supports than we are in the classroom, but then fading those out over time if the student can be more successful. So really looking at the maintenance and generalization of skills. And the last one you've actually seen before because it was in the social, emotional, behavioral, and student well-being section as well of HLPs, but looking at constructive feedback to guide student learning. Making sure that we have feedback that is consistent and positive over time. So in the chat for me, if you don't mind, what are the key purposes of providing feedback? And why is it important for the teacher to be more positive than negative with their feedback? Yeah, let students know if they're on track or missing an important piece of information. Let students know if they're exactly, Libby and Katie are spot on with their answers. So when we're talking about feedback, if we just let students continue going, it's a lot harder to unlearn something than to learn it correctly the first way or the first time. And that's what we want to teach our students correctly the first time. So the more feedback that we can give them, we can really stop those misconceptions from happening. And the second question, why is it more important to be positive over negative feedback? Yeah, positive builds self-confidence. And going back to that student self-efficacy, like we talked about at the beginning, if we're constantly tearing students down, we're not building that efficacy. And students have to believe that they can do it. Yeah, even as adults, we want positive feedback. Absolutely. Negative feedback can cause students to shut down. Yeah, we need to talk students. It is okay to correct students and say, no, that's not right, but here's why, and here's how you fix it. But to just say no and move on, that's not helpful for the student. And it definitely can affect their ability to even do better on the next thing, because they're constantly thinking that they can't do it or they're not enough. Definitely that shut down feeling. So key purposes of feedback: guide and improve student learning and behavior. And then why do we want to keep it positive? Just like the things that you said: increase motivation, engagement, and independence. Feedback really quickly. We'll end with a fun fact. How many positive to negative feedback should you have? So how many positives to outweigh a negative? Did I word that right, Katie? Twyla says 3-1. Twyla, you are exactly right. And I will say, so it's, the research says 3 to 4 to 1. So 3 to 4 positives to 1 negative. However, when we're talking about at-risk learners, and we're talking about learners who have predominantly received negative feedback or have had a history of failures in the past, then their positive to negative, research shows, really needs to be more at 14 to 1. So 3 to 4 for your typical learner, but if you have someone who's more at risk, 14 to 1. So think about, when we're providing that feedback or that corrective action, are we thinking about 14 to 1? That's a pretty high number. I even think about it like outside of the classroom, but in parenting. Am I really positive 4 times to 1? Some days I am, some days I'm not, right? Some days are easier than others, but definitely just something to consider in your current practice. Really try to focus on that positive feedback or even corrective feedback over the negative feedback, and even more so for the kids that it seems to be the hardest with. We will conclude tonight just by looking at HLPs and effective special education teachers, and how we know we look at the best evidence available. We talked about Hattie's work tonight. We talked about high leverage practices that are really things that we need to see frequently within our classrooms. All things I know you've heard of before, and I'm sure you're doing many of them, but kind of self-assess where you're at with these 11 high leverage practices that we talked about tonight. And if you want to dive deeper into these high leverage practices, remember, you can register now for the events that will take place from September to December, so the fall of 2024. You can register now for those on our websites, and we're going to take these at a little bit slower pace and dive a little bit deeper in. I know covering 11 in 90 minutes is a little bit difficult, but just giving you some resources to get started, and then we'll give you some more information when you come back in the fall. Really, let's end with considering the HLPs that you just learned. What are some small adjustments maybe that you can do from now until the end of the school year? You don't have to come up with an action plan per se, but maybe in the chat, if you could tell me something you want to start doing, something you maybe want to stop doing, and something you want to continue doing in order to implement some of these high leverage practices on a more consistent basis. And you can pick one of the 3. You don't have to do start, stop, and continue. Twyla's going to focus on positive feedback and celebrate students. Great. If you're thinking of one or can't think of one, I think one of the things alongside positive feedback is really looking at your opportunities to respond within the classroom. Again, if that's something that you might want to pull up that Anita Archer video and just take a look at how flawlessly she does that, because it's definitely, I think, something that anybody, whether you've been teaching a year or 25 years, you can definitely learn from. All right, well, thank you all for being here today. Here's what I would like. Katie, pick a number between 1 and 5 for me. 3, 1, 2, 3. Libby, if you could do me a favor, I am going to put my email in the chat. If you will email me your mailing address, we will go ahead and send you a copy of the trifolds for high leverage practices if you don't already have them. If you already have them, let me know that in the email and we can come up with another prize that you'll be able to use. Wonderful. So send me mailing address and I'll get those out by the end of the week for you. Again, thank you all so much for being here. If you could do me a huge favor, we always want to make sure that our trainings are meeting the needs of those who attend. So if you could go to iepta.org/eval, Katie put it in the chat. You can also just scan the QR code with your phone. But from the drop-down, select today's session and just give it an overall rating and let us know what we did well and what we can improve upon for future sessions. And again, if you're interested in registering for those trainings starting in September, you can do that by going to iepta.org and clicking on the workshops tab or that QR code on the right-hand side of the screen. All right, you all, thanks for spending your afternoon with me and have a great evening. And we'll see you next time. Have a good one.